Good evening, Politics of Education students. This is Gerardo Lopez again. I apologize for not being able to be there tonight, but I do have an engagement and then I'm actually picking somebody up from the airport. So that's the reason why I couldn't be there. But I did volunteer to give some answers to some questions from the group that's presenting today. So before I get to that, I want to thank Anik and Wanshi and Leka and Sunya for inviting me to talk about my article. They've asked me a couple of questions that they would like for me to address, and so I am pre-recording this from my living room. Welcome to my kitchen. Welcome to my kitchen, and. And in some ways, I think it's really nice that I get to interact and talk with you from this space, because the kitchen table is really an important space to talk and to bring some of these issues in a much more informal way, if you will. First, I want to talk to you about the article and why I wrote it and what I was hoping to accomplish with this particular piece. Suffice it to say that I wrote the article during a time when I was sufficiently frustrated with a lot of what was going on in the field, and not just in the field of the politics of education, but the field of educational leadership as a whole. I think that there was several of us, including Dr. Parker, who, by the way, was my professor. But there were several of us who were dissatisfied with what was going on, and the field's kind of inability to really tackle in a comprehensive and cogent and critical way issues of race and class and gender and sexual orientation and disabilities and other areas of difference, as well as how those areas of difference intersect with each other. And there was just a lot of frustration, I think, and not a lot of theoretical frameworks to really help us make sense of some of this and some of these issues. When critical race theory came along, Dr. Parker was one of the kind of pioneers in that particular area of importing that into the educational arena very early on. We're talking over 20 years ago. And I think at that point, many of us who were learning either under Dr. Parker or under Dr. Danny Solorzano at UCLA or Gloria Ladson-Billings at Wisconsin, we found this body of work, critical race theory, to be something that was really exciting, something that we kind of didn't really know a lot about, because it was coming out of the educational law arena that was being introduced by some of these professors, and they were learning about it, and they were saying this is really exciting stuff, and we found that as something that was equally exciting and powerful. We felt that it can serve as a great way, as a great vehicle, as a tool to help us make sense of some of these issues and really put some meat on the proverbial bones to be able to make sense of some of our own frustrations within the field. But when I wrote this particular piece, I was frustrated with the field's lack of attention to issues of race and the way the politics of education really kind of dealt with issues of interest and issues of conflict and issues of power in a very kind of a disarticulated way. It was a very kind of rational choice theory driven field. The politics of education is, political science is, just as economics is, but it didn't do a really good job in explaining why, for example, certain populations either did not engage politically in or didn't engage in the political arena as their white counterparts did. And so, for example, political science, things like voting behavior or, special interest groups or calling up your senators and getting involved in the political arena really was something that was perpetuated. They felt that that was the way in which change happens. But many of us who grew up in communities of color, many of us who grew up in low SES communities knew that this wasn't the reality for our communities. And, as a matter of fact, most of our communities did not engage in the political arena in those ways. And so, and there's specific reasons for that. And part of what I was trying to articulate is that that the field as a whole isn't doing a good job in kind of capturing the totality of political participation or non-participation. In fact, it kept perpetuating this belief that this is the only way in which folks can effect change, if you will. And so it started off with that frustration. And what I wanted to do was kind of identify just some of the ways in which the curriculum just didn't really live up to explaining some of these broader issues that I knew and others around me knew to be real, to be really happening in marginalized communities. And so, suffice it to say that when I wrote this particular piece, it was with that in mind. And so, E. Schatzschneider's piece, "The Semi-Sovereign People," is one that every political science classroom kind of deals with. It's one of the staple ideas and concepts that's discussed within political science, and the theory goes, that if there's a conflict, the most important part is not, that actor A and actor B that are at the center of the conflict, but it's the audience that's attracted to this particular conflict. The audience is the one that's going to determine the outcome, and E. Schatzschneider kind of used this. This example of a riot that took place in Harlem in 1943, and how the riot was kind of an example of how that it's not really the actors that were at the center of this, but everybody else that kind of got attracted to this, and that concept really has been used to help us understand, for example, why other players are invited into this political spectacle to help us solve or resolve political differences. That's why people say you should call your legislators. That the more people that get involved, the higher the chances of resolving things. In the direction that of the audience, if you will. The audience gets to determine that outcome. So my uneasiness with that is that particular story was kind of brought up by Schatzschneider and then immediately dropped. And there was never kind of a discussion about, why African Americans, would be attracted or drawn into this particular conflict. And so, you had to go back to 1943 and really understand what was the situation that was happening. You were just coming out of you were in the middle actually of a war, and there was fighting a racist Hitler abroad and kind of having to come back into the United States and dealing with racism, in your own country. That was, hypocritical in many ways. And so I think that, you dovetail that with the just kind of horrible living conditions in New York City at the time for African Americans, and as well as the blatant racism that they had to live with day in and day out, not just the inability to get jobs, and because jobs were unionized, and union jobs went to white workers and not to workers of color. So you add all these variables in, and a lot of that really helps explain a lot of the frustrations that um, resulted or were the impetus for this particular riot. But Schatzschneider dealt with none of that. And so, so I think that part of what I was trying to do was really tell, if you will, a counter story of what was going on during that time. That really kind of would help us get a different perspective of the Schatzschneider story. But again, I was trying to use the Schatzschneider story as a way to help us understand the shortcomings in the field as a whole. In other words, the theories that we learn about the field are short-sighted because the theoretical concepts that we have available to us are also short-sighted. So that's really what I was trying to capture within my piece. I raised some fundamental questions at the end of that to really try to get us to think about, would the riot have happened if the social conditions for African Americans at that time were not as egregious as they were? Would the conflict have happened if the folks at the center of the conflict were both white, or if they were both black? Would it have escalated to that level of a riot? And so those are important questions for us to consider as we kind of unpackage that story that Schatzschneider uses to basically ground his whole theory of the socialization of conflict. So I'm going to move right along and answer some of the questions that were posed by the group for today. Question number 1, with racism being systemic and having so many intersections, what are some good first steps to take for ourselves to help build our knowledge base, the knowledge base of those around us, and to make an actual difference in our schools? Well, I think that a couple of good first steps is really to become aware of what's going on. I mean, I think that oftentimes we think about these issues of race and racism as just kind of being something that is overt or explicit, and I think that oftentimes, and this is what critical race theory was teaching us, is that racism isn't just kind of these overt intentional acts, if you will, lynchings or calling somebody the N-word or something of so offensive in that way, the separate drinking fountains or what have you that we had in the 1950s. The racism that we have today is really much more systemic. It's everywhere. It's all around us. It's in the air we breathe. And so because it's we're so used to seeing it, we become immune to it. It's almost like a well-worn pair of glasses. We don't see it anymore because we're used to seeing it's just the way things are. And so part of what I think critical race theory is trying to get us to really think critically about is that racism is not something of the past. Racism is something that's with us today. Racism is something that's present with us today. And so we, the first step is to really recognize racism in all its forms, in all its manifestations, and to become, kind of consciously aware of its workings, not only in how we see the world and come to understand it, but that it's not always necessarily, grounded in some sort of explicit, egregious act, and I think that nowadays more than ever, we tend to kind of equate it with, okay, if you're for the wall or if you're, questioning, or you're supporting a Muslim ban, then ergo you must be racist. No, I think that those are, again, that's a very simplistic way of thinking about racism. Those are racialized and grounded in racism, but racism is much more systemic. It's in the everyday. It's in the politics of the everyday, and we have to kind of understand it at that level. And it's in our curriculum, it's in what we teach, it's in how we teach, it's in why, something as basic as why Johnny can't read. There's all sorts of racialized assumptions surrounding that. And suffice it to say that that racism is pervasive, and it acts in both in both directions. The race problem, if you will, isn't just the fact that people of color are rendered one down in society. It's also that why, for example, when we're talking about issues of race, you know. White populations don't tend to think of themselves as being racialized, and I think that therein lies a real troubling concept or issue that I think our white brothers and sisters really have to deal with and disentangle and wrestle with on their own. That racism works both ways. That the race problem isn't just with people of color; it's also with white people being raced individuals and not recognizing that they're raced individuals. Just like whites are raced, just like men are gendered. It's not just women are gendered, or straight people have a sexual orientation. That is a sexual orientation, and so I think it begins with recognizing privilege and understanding privilege at that particular point. And I think that once we start with that level, I think it becomes easier to have a different conversation about race, class, gender, etc. issues in society. It's not an easy task, I will say that, because that's probably the hardest part, is recognizing privilege, is having folks recognize the way in which privilege works, and that's probably the harder task. I'll move on to question number 2. How does one know if they are acting in convergence with civil rights interests or truly as an ally to marginalized populations groups? Suffice it to say that that interest convergence isn't necessarily kind of like it's one of those things that I want to separate it from the issue of allyship, and in part because I think that the way it's kind of articulated within the social sciences and within economics is that, when there's some sort of, kind of very specific decision or issue that impacts people of color, that it has to work in the interest of whites in order for whites to really work in the interest of promote civil rights for communities of color. And I think that's an economic issue, and we have to kind of understand basic fundamental economics from that point. So I think the issue of allyship is a little bit different in which folks are beginning to think about, what does it mean to be an ally? What does it mean to really advocate and put myself on the line, if you will, for another human being, for another life? And again, I think true allyship, doesn't demand anything in return. True allyship is a gift, and people do, they become allies because it's for the betterment of humanity, and not necessarily because we want something back, or we receive something back. And I think that's important. It's an important distinction because far too often people are doing something because it makes them feel good, or they're doing something because they're going to look like a good ally. I'm not like these other men, or I'm not like these other white people, or I'm not these other heterosexuals. I'm a different person. By doing that, it automatically puts the focus back on you, as opposed to putting the focus back on the communities that are disempowered and on the communities that you're trying to work to support. And so it's important for you, if you are truly wanting to be an ally, you do it because it's the right thing to do, not because you're going to get something out of it in return. So I'll move right along to the next question. How can we use tension, conflict in our own schools to create change for marginalized groups? That's a really important question. I think that in my opinion, I do think that tension is the point where change happens. Tension and uncomfortableness is where learning takes place, because the fact that individuals are uncomfortable because of the fact that they're kind of learning something new, learning something that they didn't learn before. I think that those are the moments in which learning takes place, and those are the moments that I think true educators really want to be able to push individuals without alienating them. They have to be able to push folks, gently, if you will, to make them to this point of uncomfortableness, so that learning can actually take place. I think we've gotten to a point where folks don't want to kind of be uncomfortable. We've gotten to a point where we've gotten very comfortable with our own positions, that we don't like to rock the boat, the proverbial boat. It makes other people uncomfortable. And by doing so, then we just kind of like stay within the status quo. And I think that what we really need to be thinking about as critical educators, as critical individuals, as folks who are truly interested in seeing social change, we have to be able to push that. And again, without the caveat is that you can't kind of push too hard, and you can't kind of force an idea on somebody else, because they're just going to turn away. And that's a natural psychological response. If somebody's trying to convince me that my own thoughts, my own thinkings are somehow wrong, my natural tendency is to say, that's you. You're just a crazy person. Get away from me. But I think that if somebody is truly trying to engage us with love, with caring, with a true concern for making the world a much better place, then I think we enter that conversation in a very different way. And I think individuals appreciate that when they're trying to say, these are the shortcomings, and they're not bad shortcomings. They're just shortcomings that you have in our logics, in the way we think, and the way we come to see the world. But unfortunately, we're living in a very polarized society in which name calling and vitriol has really taken place. Just look at your Facebook feeds or your social media feeds. We live in silos, and if anybody kind of tries to step outside of the silo, not only do you get kind of beat up by the other side, but you also get beat up by your own side. And so I think that we're in this particular day and age, it's really, really tough to have a conversation that pushes individuals to think differently, because the line in the sand has really forced us, if you will, into kind of these political and ideological camps that are really hard to break out of. And so I think that the brave individuals, the true kind of visionaries, are those who kind of break outside of these particular camps and are able to call their own communities out on their own shortcomings and their own kind of arrogant positions that assume that they know more than anybody else. And again, I think that it has to happen from a space of love. It has to happen from a space of humility. It has to happen from a space of caring and a space in which we're willing to push each other to be uncomfortable and to be comfortable with our uncomfortableness, so that we can grow and learn and create a new world together. I'm going to answer one last question, if you will, and then I'll call it an evening. Let's see. Interested in future work that I've done in this area, and some of my own counter stories. Well, I can't really share like too many counter stories. Suffice it to say that my own kind of position, I think, in academe, and Dr. Parker's position in academe, we're a testament to a counter story. We're many of our communities aren't really represented in institutions of higher education to large numbers, and so the fact that 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 we're here, the fact that we're serving in professor roles, and the fact that we're both in full professor roles, I think is a counter story in and of itself. These are stories that I think aren't necessarily told because when you think about your academic or your professor, you don't necessarily think about professors of color per se. And so, because there's not too many of us, and so I do think that that our own kind of presence in the classroom, in the university classroom, is a counter story in itself. Lastly, further work. I think you all read the Politics of Education piece. I've continued doing work within critical race theory. I've applied it to parent involvement issues. I've done some work on that, and lately I've actually wrote a piece maybe 2 years ago that was nominated for and got selected to be an article of the year in Educational Administration Quarterly that deals with the Brown decision at 60 years old, and how we need to ask fundamentally different questions about Brown versus Board of Education, that so that we don't continue to have this same conversation about Brown over and over again. We had a discussion, Brown at 30. What does it mean now that Brown versus Board is 30 years old? And we had a Brown at 40, and then we had a Brown at 50, and now we had a Brown at 60. So I pretty much said, like, why do we keep having the Brown at whatever, and how long are we going to keep doing this? Let's kind of like recognize that Brown was Brown 1 was a great decision, Brown 2 was a shoddy decision, and we're living with the messages of Brown 2. And so part of what I was trying to kind of get to is how do we have a fundamentally different conversation about Brown, so that we don't continue to have this conversation 60 years from now, and Brown at 120. So look for those articles. If you need a copy of those, I'd be more than happy to get those to you. Just email me, gerardo.lopez@utah.edu. Again, thank you very much for your time. I've gone way over my 20 minutes. It's now 26 minutes. And again, thanks to Anik and Wanshi, Leka, Sunia. Gracias for all of you for indulging me for close to a half hour. I appreciate your time, and we'll see you later.